Rapture becomes her. Chapter 1. He was going to die, Barnaby thought incredulously. He was going to drown in the middle of the night in the midst of a storm sweeping across the English Channel, and no one would ever know what had happened to the most recent holder of the title, viz. Count Jocelyn. He would have simply vanished. A crackling bolt of silver lightning snaked across the black night sky, and through the heavy rain Barnaby glanced desperately around, trying to get his bearings, searching frantically for something he used to save himself. But all that met his gaze was rolling seas. There was no land or sign of rescue to be seen. He was going to die, he thought again, as the brightness from the lightning vanished, and he was left alone in the blackness, fighting to keep afloat in the churning water. He admitted that there would be some in London who would rejoice at his passing, and heading that list would be his newly met English cousin, Matthew Jocelyn. Matthew had been furious that the title long considered his was going to an American with it, the Johnson family fortune and estates. A bloody half-breed colonist, Viscount Jocelyn? It is an insult. Matthew sneered at their first meeting 3 months ago in October in the London solicitor's office. Barnaby didn't blame Matthew for being angry. In Matthew's shoes, he might have felt the same way. But he wasn't about to allow the slur to pass. You are mistaken, Barnaby drawled. It was my grandmother who was half Cherokee. He smiled, showing his excellent teeth. But I warned you, you would be wise not to use that term again in my hearing. As for being a colonist, his black eyes full of mockery, he continued. I think you forget that America gained her independence from Britain a decade ago. I am a citizen of the United States. Very well, Matthew snapped, his cheeks faintly flushed, but it is insupportable that someone like you should think to step so easily into command of my great uncle's estates. Good God, man, you don't know the first thing about running an estate like Windmere. You're little more than a backwoods upstart. Barnaby held on to his temper with an effort, thinking that it wouldn't help his cause any if his first act as Lord Jocelyn was to throttle his cousin. He took a deep breath and letting the last comment ride for now, said quickly, I would remind you that I am not uneducated and that I have been overseeing my own plantation in Virginia for a number of years. I'll grant you that Green Hill is not as vast as Windmere. There will be differences, but I am quite capable of managing Windmere. Matthew's lips tightened. Perhaps, but you are a fool if you think that someone with a grandmother who was a part savage would be eagerly accepted by the son as Viscount Jocelyn. Considering the situation with France, you should be more worried about the fact that my grandmother's father was a Frenchman, Barnaby retorted, the expressions of horror on the faces of those present at this new abomination had Barnaby biting the inside of his cheek to keep from grinning. He, his gaze swept the handsome room, and with his foes momentarily silenced, he rose to his impressive height and walked to the door. His hand on the knob, he looked back at Matthew and said softly, Upstart I may be, but I never lived in the backwoods, and you, sir, can go hang, and for all I care, take the title with you. It had been a pleasurable moment, but as he lifted his face above, the next wave and the cold seeped deeper into his bones. Bonaparte tried to remember the events leading up to his present predicament, but his thoughts were sluggish and erratic, like a serpent curling around his prey. The icy water was intoxicably draining the life from him, and with every second his will to survive wavered. It would be so easy, so simple, he thought, to let the storm have its way, so easy to stop fighting and allow himself to be pulled down to the depths. A wave slapped him in the face, startling him and shattering the seductive song of death that crooned in his head. With a curse, He renewed his struggle to stay afloat in the darkness, if only for a few seconds longer. Ignoring the stinging pain at the back of his head, he vaguely remembered freeing his knife fastened at his ankle and adjusting his boots and heavy greatcoat along with his jacket within minutes of hitting the water, knowing they would only weight him down. He held on to the knife for a while, until he realized it was hampering his ability to swim, and then reluctantly he let the waves take it. Those memories did him little good because he still had no idea how he had ended up in the channel, yet oddly enough, he knew he was in the English Channel. But where or how he had gotten there, he had no inkling. His mind was blank as much from the leather cold as the blood he had lost from the wound on the back of his head. He frowned. How the devil did he know he had a wound? And how did he know that the wound had bled? Again he had no answers, and as his head slipped beneath the onslaught of another wall of water, the urge to end it, to let the cold in the channel have its way, was nearly impossible to resist. But as his friends often pointed out, he could be stubborn as a mule, and with a powerful kick of his long legs, he soared up above the waves. He swore with a fierce grin, going to make it easy for anyone and anything to kill him. Another streak of lightning lit the black sky, and in that moment, Barnabas spied something that made his heart leap. Several planes linked together, bobbed in the water, not 6 feet from him. He half recognized them as being a section of the floor of the yacht he had inherited along with everything else owned by the late 7th Viscount Jocelyn. Fighting his way toward the beacon of hope, those boards represented, he struggled to think where the yacht had been moored, and then it came to him near Eastbourne of Essex coast. But what in the hell had he been doing there? He had no time for further thought. All of his focus was on surviving, and though it seemed that it took him hours to reach those planks in mere minutes, his fingers brushed against the slippery wood. Getting himself out of the water took longer. The tossing waves and the shifting, slick surface of the planks thwarted his efforts, but finally he was able to heave himself aboard the makeshift raft. Gasping for breath, he rolled off onto his back, and with his face pelted by rain, he stared up at the black sky. He was freezing, his teeth chattering, his body shaking from the cold, and he suspected he had traded one form of death for another. Exposure would kill him, as sure as a hangman's noose, but he wouldn't die. He consoled himself grimly by drowning, and that, he thought as he drifted into unconsciousness, was a victory of sorts. As he dared as Jeb Brown, ghoulishly above the shrinking wind and rain whipping around outside the best room at the Crown. It was a pleasant room with high open beam ceilings and a gleaming oak floor covered here and there with cheerful rag rugs. The space dominated by a huge bed, impressively draped with a rich green silk canopy. A fire glowed orange and gold on the brick hearth. Soft yellow light from several candles lit by Mrs. Gilbert, the widow owner of the Crown, flickered about the room, and, despite the snarling storm, cast a cozy spell. Mrs. Gilbert, her liberally streaked gray hair half hidden beneath a muslin cap, gave a sharp shake of her head. No, he's not dead, half drowned and near frozen, but not dead. Jacob looked to the other occupant in the room, a tall, fair-haired young youth wearing breeches, boots, and a leather jerkin over a billowy long-sleeved shirt. Looking beyond the boy's garb, closer inspection revealed that the slim shape and finely etched features belonged to a young woman. Her thick silvery blonde hair pulled back into a quail tied with a bit of black ribbon. I tell you, Miss Emily, it was pure luck I spied him, Jeb said, his wrinkled fisherman's face full of wonder. With the storm and all, it's black as midnight out there. And if it hadn't been for this bloody big bolt of lightning at the very second I was looking in his direction, I never would have seen him. He shook his head. Good for him that we had a run tonight, else we'd be finding his body washed up somewhere along the shore, if we found it at all. Emily Townsend nodded and walked closer to stare down at the man Jeb had pulled from the waters of the channel. He was indeed lucky, Emily said, her gaze running over the man who lay still and silent beneath Mrs. Gilbert's examination. His hair was black, his skin so dark it was almost swarthy except for the worrisome blue cast to his lips. From what she could see, he was an exceptionally tall, thick man, and a stranger to all of them. Mrs. Gilbert muttered, "He had the devil's own luck, I say." Looking up from examination, she added briskly, "Most likely will recover with no ill efforts." Her hand on the cold, damp blankets that Jeb had wrapped the stranger in once he dragged him on board his boat and stripped off the wet clothes. She glanced over her shoulder. "Miss Emily, you need to leave the room now," she ordered, "and let Jeb and I put this nightshirt on him and get him into a warm bed." When Emily hesitated, Mrs. Gilbert's plump face softened. She said, "I know you have dozens of questions to ask Jeb, but go fetch those hot water bottles I left in the kitchen." When Emily's jaw took on that mulish cast they all knew so well, Mrs. Gilbert said firmly, "It wouldn't be proper for you to stay. By the time he returns, we'll have them snug and warm between the sheets. Now go." Emily snorted at Mrs. Gilbert's determination to treat her like some gently born miss just out of the schoolroom. It was true she was gently born. Her father had been a local squire until his death 7 years ago, but she turned 6 and 20 months ago she was no child. As she reminded herself, it wasn't for her, Jed wouldn't have been running a load of contraband from France tonight, and a stranger wouldn't have been found. She had every right to remain, but from past experience she knew that there was no arguing with Mrs. Gilbert, and reluctantly she left the room. Never one to bud. By the time she reached the inn's kitchen she was smiling. "No one," she admitted ruefully, as she picked up the hot water bottles and accepted the heated brick thrust into her hands by Flora, the middle Gilbert daughter. No matter what age or standing, disobeyed Mrs. Gilbert. Even her cousin, the dissolute Squire Townsend, was known to scramble away like a schoolboy to escape a tongue lashing by Mrs. Gilbert. When she had returned, the stranger was decently garbed in an old nightshirt that had belonged to Mrs. Gilbert's deceased husband, and tucked beneath the quilt. The heated brick was placed at his feet, the water bottle snuggled up against his sides. Mrs. Gilbert shooed Jeb from the room, and after taking one last look around, said to Emily, "I'll send Mary up with some warm water and a cloth. You can clean that nasty gash on his head." With a meaningful look at Emily, she added, "We wasted enough time as it is. The others need to be on their way." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Gilbert shook her finger at her. "I know," said Mrs. Gilbert, "you think you should be the one down there dealing with them, but for once, act like the lady you were raised to be and stay up there out of sight. Please." Emily hesitated. "Keep an eye out for anything out of the ordinary," she finally said. "My cousin has been acting strangely lately, and I think he is spying on her." She took a deep breath and confessed in a rush. "Every night for the past week or so, someone, and I suspect it is my cousin, has tried to gnaw up to my room." At Mrs. Gilbert's quick intake of breath, she said quickly, "Don't worry, I keep the door locked and the chest of drawers pushed against it, so does Anne or whoever it was goes away. But it would not be good if my cousin found me gone from my bed," she swallowed, "if he were to discover what we were about." Mrs. Gilbert looked grim. "You don't think he saw you leave tonight and follow you when you left the manor, do you?" "I don't believe so, but I have the feeling ever since I slipped from my room that something wasn't right, that something was wrong." She glanced at the stranger. "First him, and then—" she shivered. "I feel like a goose, but I still haven't been able to stop myself from looking over my shoulders all night. I keep feeling as if someone is watching me. Us." Wearily she added, "If the door to my bedroom was forced and Geoffrey discovered my room was empty, this is probably the first place he'd look." Mrs. Gilbert's lips thinned. "Well, he won't find you. We'll have you on your way back to the manor quicker than a cat can lick its ear." Giving Emily a fine pat on the shoulder, she said, "You worry too much, my dear. You always have. The stranger's arrival has put us all in the drifter. I'm sure that's all it is." She looked around the room one last time and said, "And now I must go and see if Jeb and the others are loaded up and ready to leave. I'll send Mary to you with those rags and the warm water. She can keep you company while I'm gone." Mrs. Gilbert bustled from the room. Shortly, Mary showed up with the cloth and bowl of water. At 17, Mary was the youngest of the 5 Gilbert daughters, and her blue eyes wide with excitement. She approached the bed and stared at the stranger. "Cool!" she exclaimed. "He isn't dead, is he?" she asked, echoing Jeb's earlier question. Emily smiled faintly and said, "No, he just looks dead, but your mother says he will recover." Her smile became a grin, "and we all know your mother is never wrong." Mary grinned back at her. "You can wager your last guinea on that." Taking a clean white cloth and dipping it into the bowl of water, gingerly, Emily began to clean the ugly wound, wincing when the man groaned at her ministrations. "Just as while he's unconscious," she thought, as she dipped and rubbed the length of the gash. Mary shuddered as another violent gust of wind slammed into the walls of the inn. "Ma says it's a miracle he's alive. Not many survive a dip in the channel on a night like tonight." Concentrating on the task at hand, Emily nodded and murmured, "I wonder what he was doing out there and who he is." Mary paled as the thought struck her. "Oh, miss, you don't think he's a revenue, do you? Haven't cleaned the wound as good as it was going to get under her hands." Emily dropped the blood-stained rag in the water and studied the man's features, noting the broad forehead, the high cheekbones, and the generous mouth. She had nothing to base it on, but revenue would be the last occupation she would have just guessed this man to ply. There was something about his face. Emily shook her head. "No, I don't think he's a revenue." Lifting the quote, she looked down at his hands, studying the long, elegant fingers and the clean and trim fingernails. She frowned and glanced over at Mary. Did Jed bring the clothes the man was wearing with him to the inn, or leave them on board the boat? Mary's pretty face grew animated. "They're downstairs drying by the fire in a little private room at the back. Do you think they'll tell us who he is?" Emily spared the stranger one last look. He seemed to be resting easier, and the faint blueness around his lips was fading. There was nothing more she could do for him for now. Rising to her feet, she said, "I think we'll know more about him than we do right now if we take a look at what he was wearing." Then Jed pulled him out of the channel. The clothes told Emily quite a bit. Though damaged by salt water, the throat white lining shirt was expensive and sewn by an expert seamstress, and the cream and fawn patterned silk waistcoat was something only a wealthy man would own, as was the room pocket watch and the gold chain and fob. The water-stained cravat, like the shirt, was of the best linen, and the finely knitted pantaloons also would have belonged to a man of means. When he gone into the water to avoid the extra weight, she assumed his boots and coat had been wisely discarded. Staring at the items draped over a pair of chairs near the roaring fire, Emily considered what she learned. The stranger was apparently a wealthy man, not a revenue. That much was certain. Leaving his clothes behind, Emily dismissed Mary and returned upstairs. Resuming her seat beside the man on the bed, she stared at him, as if willing him to wake and tell her who he was and how he got into the channel. Being a daughter of the previous squire, and having lived all of her life near a small village nestled in the Cuckmere Valley, she was intimately familiar with the local inhabitants. Her mouth twisted, and since her cousin had stepped into her father's position, she had ultimately become familiar with several randy young bucks and widows of questionable morals from London who made up her cousin's circle of friends. This man was a complete stranger, but he wasn't just any bit of flotsam tossed up in the belly of the channel either. He was wealthy, and his hands told her that he was a member of the gentry, perhaps even a member of the aristocracy. Her expression puzzled. She continued to stare at him. There had been no gossip about someone of his description visiting any of the great houses in the surrounding countryside. So who was he, and why was he found drifting in the channel on a wicked night like tonight? As if to punctuate her thoughts, a shaft of wind suddenly shrieked down the chimney, making her jump. Amused at her reaction and noting that the fire was dying, Emily got up and walked over to poke at the fire, sending a shower of sparks flying upward. From a neat stack nearby, she threw on several more pieces of wood, and only when the fire was crackling and snapping to her satisfaction did she take a seat in the high-backed tapestry-covered chair near the fire. She looked over at the stranger and was pleased to see that there was a faint flush to his cheeks, that his lips were a more natural color, the blueness having faded as his body warmed. Mrs. Gilbert was right. He should recover. with the stranger's most immediate needs taken care of. She dismissed them from her mind and turned her attention to what Mrs. Gilbert and Jip were doing at this very minute. And she wondered again if she had made the right decision 4 years ago. She resisted the idea in the beginning, and for the first few years following her father's death, despite the unpleasant intrusion of her cousin and his drain on the family estate, she managed to keep her great aunt Cornelia and her stepmother Anne feeling insulated and comfortable. Once her cousin had frittered away the bulk of the tidy fortune her father had amassed and began to ravage the estate for money to squander at the gaming tables and brothels in London, she had no choice. With the Essex coast only a few miles away, Emily had grown up hearing all the stories about the local smugglers, and so it wasn't much an outrageous decision, for as far back as she could remember, Cook and even their butler Walker had filled her head with legendary tales of the smugglers' bravery and cleverness in outwitting the custom officials and the heartless riding officers. When feeling mellow, even Cornelia had been known to tell a rollicking good story about the smugglers who piled the trade just off the coast. Many in the area were not smugglers themselves, but relatives of smugglers or were aligned with the smugglers. By the time she was 10, Emily could have named several known smugglers in a dozen or more villages and farm laborers who helped transport the contraband goods to the outskirts of London. Her father had not been above accepting without comment the packet of tea, the cask of French brandy, or the bulk of fine silk that periodically appeared in his stables, and usually the morning after several of his horses were found standing in his stalls, muddy and exhausted. Realizing that she had to do something to save them all from ending up destitute or nearly as bad at the complete mercy of her cousin, turning to smuggling had been a simple step. As she admitted, with a clenched jaw, there had been another reason her little smuggling operation kept several villagers in their homes and saved them from the workhouse or being reduced to homeless beggars. The sudden death of her father from a broken neck when his horse had balked at a fence and thrown him while he had been fox hunting in Lancashire had stung the family in the neighborhood. And her stepmother, only 2 years her senior, had been shattered by the news of her husband's death and had lost the baby she had been carrying. It had been a terrible time. Not only had the Lowe family suffered the devastating loss of nephew, father, and husband, but Geoffrey Townsend, the son of the old squire's younger brother, had gleefully stepped into his shoes and took up the position as head of the family. It wasn't a good fit. The new squire was as different from the old squire as chalk to cheese. Certainly, Geoffrey was no family man, and had no time or patience for a cantankerous old woman, a weeping widow who just lost her husband and stillborn child, and the fierce-eyed Emily. Only grudgingly he accepted their presence in a lovely manor house that has housed the Townsend family for over 2 centuries. The stranger stared, groaning and pushing aside her unpleasant memories. She hurried to his side. Hovering over him, she brushed back a strand of stiffened black hair from his forehead. She watched him for several more seconds, but he gave no further indication that he was coming awake, staring intently at the dark face and noticing the thick black brows, the ridiculously long lashes of his eyes. She wondered again he was and why he had been in the channel. Did he have a family worried about him? A mother, a wife, children? The wound bothered her. It looked to her as if something or someone had brought something very hard and very heavy down the stranger's head. Not that she was an expert, but in the 4 years since she had undertaken to rescue them all from destitution by smuggling, she had cleaned and patched and sewed up her share of wounds. Some were simply the result of the dangers faced at sea, others from clashes with the revenuers or with the vicious Noel's gang that claimed this part of Sussex as their own. She'd seen this kind of wound before, and the cause was casual, unusually a blow to the back of the head. Faith, at 28, the eldest Gilbert daughter, opened the door, peeked inside. Seeing Emily standing beside the bed, she came into the room and stood by her side. Whoever he is, he's quite handsome, isn't he? Emily shrugged. Thinking of her cousin, she muttered, handsome as handsome does. She glanced at Faith. Has your mother returned? No, but young Sam slipped by to say that she wouldn't be long. Did he say why the delay? Emily glanced at the painted china clock on the mantel. It's approaching 2 o'clock in the morning. The ponies should have been loaded and on their way by now. I expect the storm is the reason they're running late. There's always been a storm of faith, Emily said impatiently. It shouldn't have made a difference. Well, that's true, but with the stranger and all. Emily sighed. Faith was right. The stranger had played havoc with their schedule. Not having access to the easy landing at Cluckmere Haven like the Noel's gang, her intrepid little band of smugglers was forced to direct their contraband goods up the steep chalk face of the Seven Sisters. Without dashing him to death, getting the unconscious stranger up those same cliffs had been a slow process. Do you want me to bring you some soup or something hot to drink? Faith asked. Emily shook her head, and with her eyes on the stranger, she replied, I'm fine, and until he wakes, there's no reason to prepare anything for him either. You can go help your sisters in the kitchen. Unfaithfully, Faith eyed her. Miss, she began hesitantly, shouldn't you be riding home? You've always been away from the manor longer than usual. What if the squire misses you? With more confidence than she felt, Emily said, Don't worry. My cousin thinks I am tucked safely in my bed. Before I left, I checked on him. He was deep in his cups, with Mr. Answorth, his foppish friend he means for either Anne or myself to marry. Her eyes full of sympathy, Faith nodded, and since there was nothing else for her to do, she left for downstairs. Emily stared at the door, Faith shut behind her in sight. There were a few secrets in the village, and it was common knowledge that Townsend wanted Emily, her great aunt, and her stepmother out of the manor. The late squires were prevented Geoffrey from tossing them out of their home with only the clothes on their backs. But if he could marry off the two younger women, but short of murder or marriage, Emily thought wryly, he was stuck with them, just as they were stuck with him. The former squire has stipulated that Cornelia, Emily, and Anne were allowed to live in the manor for their lifetimes, unless, of course, they married. Her lips twitched, but Geoffrey would never be rid of great Aunt Cornelia. Emily thought with relish at her age. No one expected great Aunt Cornelia to leave the breeches any other way than in a coffin. Not only had the old squire ensured the women of his family a home for as long as necessary, he had also placed a nice sum in the funds to ensure that they would never be needy. Emily's eyes hardened. Unfortunately, her father's will hadn't gone far enough. Geoffrey, acting as head of the family and their trustees, had overseen the account and the money had vanished. He may have gotten his hands on the money, Emily acknowledged, but he couldn't budge them from the manor. Only by marriage or murder would they leave their home behind. But Geoffrey wasn't ready to murder them yet, she admitted with a curl of her lip, thinking of Mr. Answorth. Mr. Answorth was the latest in the line of unsuitable suitors Geoffrey had dredged up and forced under their noses. But Answorth was different, and he worried Emily. She and Cornelia had managed to send the others packing, but Answorth was proving difficult to discourage, and she wondered if it had been he who had tried to knock to her bedroom this past week. Answorth had a compelling reason to want a wife, due to turn 5 and 30 in a matter of a few months. If he was not married to a respectable woman by his 35th birthday, he would lose a handsome fortune. It was well known for the last year or so that Answorth was hanging out for a wife, but since his reputation was reprehensible, there were few respectable ladies willing to entertain his suit. And that despicable creature, Emily thought furiously, is the man Geoffrey thinks one of us should marry. Her hands tightened to fists. By heaven, she liked to run the pair of them through. A sudden awareness sent a trickle of ease down her spine, and she glanced over to the man in the bed. Her heart skidded in her chest when she saw that the stranger was awake and staring at her. Forcing a smile, she walked over to the side of the bed. You have a miraculous escape, sir, she explained. If Jeb had inspired you when he did, I fear it would have gone badly for you. Eyes black as midnight studied her face. Where am I? He asked flatly. One hand shot out from beneath the pile of quilt and fastened like an iron disc around her slender wrist. And who are you, boy? With swiftness, Barnaby Meyer, a small knife appeared in the boy's other hand. A second later, the blade was pressed against his throat. The boy smiled fiercely and said softly, I think, sir, that should be my question. Who the hell are you? Finally,